The wagon that brought her to Cutter's Bluff was hauling feed grain, and the man driving it had not spoken a single word in 4 hours, which suited Della Crane just fine. She had run out of things to say somewhere back in Missouri. Not because she was a quiet woman by nature, she was not, but because the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from losing everything and then deciding to keep moving anyway had a way of using up words before they reached the mouth. She sat in the wagon bed with her back against a sack of oats and her carpet bag wedged between her knees, and she watched the territory open up ahead of her the way a wound opens, wide and raw and impossible to look away from. She was 28 years old. She had been a daughter, then a wife, then a widow, all in the space of a life that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Her father's stud farm outside of Lexington had been sold 2 years prior to cover his debts, and the man she had married 6 months after that, a salesman from Cincinnati with a good coat and a persuasive way of lipping at a person, had been dead for 11 months, leaving behind a rented room, an unpaid bill at the dry goods, and a note she had read twice before she burned it, because some things are not worth keeping. She had come west because there was east behind her, and nothing in the middle worth stopping for. The driver pulled up at the edge of a ranch lane without announcement and jerked his chin toward the gate. "Holt spread," he said. It was the first thing he had said since Sedalia. "I didn't ask for the Holt spread," she said. "You asked for work with horses." He looked at her from under the brim of his hat, a look that contained the whole of his opinion of her chances. "Holt's the only man in 50 miles who's hiring. You can walk the rest if you want." She picked up her carpet bag and climbed down from the wagon. The lane was a 1/4 mile of packed dirt between post and rail fencing, and on either side of it were horses. She slowed without meaning to. They were good horses. She could see that from 40 feet, the way a person who has grown up around quality stock sees it the way other people see a face they recognize. Clean legs, deep chests, the particular way of moving that said they had been bred for something specific and were aware of it. She counted 12 in the near pasture alone, and there were more in the distance. She picked up her pace. The ranch yard was larger than she had expected. A main house of squared timber, 2 stories, with a porch that ran the full width of the front, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a forge that was currently occupied. She could hear it before she could see it, the rhythmic ring of iron on iron. And the barn, which was enormous, its doors open to the morning and smelling of hay and horses and the particular mineral sweetness of a well-kept stable. A man came out of the barn before she reached it. He was not the owner. She knew that immediately, the way you know a second in command. He carried authority, but he carried it like a tool, not like a skin. Big through the shoulders, a face that had been outdoors for 40 years and looked it, a mustache that had opinions of its own. He looked at her the way the wagon driver had looked at her, and then he did something the wagon driver had not done. He laughed. Not loud, not cruel exactly, but entirely genuine, which was in some ways worse. "Help you?" he said, in the tone of a man who did not believe he could. "I'm looking for work," she said. "With horses. I was told the Holt ranch was hiring." He looked at her carpet bag, her dress, which was practical but not frontier practical, her hands, which were calloused in ways that did not match the dress. "We're hiring a wrangler," he said. "Not a—" He gestured at her vaguely, as if her entire person was the end of the sentence. "I am aware of what a wrangler is," she said. "I grew up on a stud farm in Kentucky, Ramsey Crane's operation, outside Lexington. If you know horses, you know the name." Something shifted in his face, not belief, but the first small crack of uncertainty. "Ramsey Crane's dead," he said. "Yes," she said. "He was my father." The foreman, she did not yet know his name, looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her toward the lane, as if hoping someone more explicable was coming behind her. "Wait here," he said. He went into the barn. She stood in the yard and let the sun hit her face and listened to the horses. The man who came out of the barn behind the foreman was not what she had expected either, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, not unusually, but the kind of tall that comes with a particular set of the shoulders that makes a person seem like they take up their full allotment of space without apology. Dark hair, a few threads of gray at the temple that he was probably not aware of, a face that had been handsome and had decided to become something more interesting instead. Not hard exactly, but set. The face of a man who had made a great number of decisions alone and had learned to live with all of them. He was looking at her with an expression that was nothing like the foreman's. There was no amusement in it. There was simply assessment, direct, unhurried, and oddly respectful in its thoroughness. "Asa Holt," he said. "Della Crane." A pause. "Ramsay Crane's daughter." "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her hands, she realized. The same place the foreman had looked, but differently. Where the foreman had looked for contradiction, Asa Holt was looking for confirmation. "What did your father run?" he said. "Thoroughbreds primarily, breeding stock and race preparation. He had 14 stallions at the height of it, 40-some mares, and I worked alongside every man on that farm from the time I was 9 years old. Foaling, training, lameness evaluation, teeth, feed ratios, temperament assessment." She said it evenly, not as a recitation, but as a statement of plain fact. "I can also stitch a wound, read a contract, and tell you within 2 minutes of watching a horse move whether it has a problem in its left front that your farrier has been missing." Asa Holt did something that the foreman had not done. He did not laugh. He did not dismiss. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Reuben." The foreman, Reuben, stepped forward with the expression of a man who had already decided something. "Give her the Grady mare," Asa said. Reuben's expression changed. "The Grady mare's been—" "I know what she's been," Asa said. He looked at Della. "The mare has been off her left front for 6 weeks. 2 different men have looked at her. Neither of them found anything." "All right," Della said. "If you find something," he said, "we'll talk about wages. If you don't—" He left the rest unfinished, not unkindly, just honestly. "That's fair," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, that same assessing look, unhurried, and then he went back inside. Reuben showed her to the barn with the barely concealed air of a man escorting someone to their own humiliation. The Grady mare was a chestnut, 7 years old, 16 hands, with the kind of quality that made Della's chest ache a little. She was standing at the back of her stall, with her weight shifted subtly, not dramatically, not enough for a casual eye, off her left front. Della saw it from the stall door. She went in quietly, the way her father had taught her. No fuss, no announcement, just presence. Let the horse decide. The mare turned her head and considered Della with the large, wary eye of an animal that had been handled too much by people who did not understand her. Della ran her hand down the mare's shoulder, her leg, the knee. She worked slowly, feeling for heat, for flinching, for the particular way muscle and tendon spoke under the hand when something was wrong. The mare shifted once, then went still. That stillness was its own kind of communication. She found it in the hoof, a small abscess, deep-seated, not yet showing at the surface. The kinds that a man looking for something dramatic would miss entirely because it was so small and so patient in its damage. She stood up and looked at Reuben, who was leaning on the stall door with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who had already written the ending. "She has an abscess in the left fore," Della said. "Deep, not broken through. You'll need to poultice it for 3 days, wet heat twice a day, and then draw it. She'll need the shoe pulled on that side until it resolves." She paused. "You probably have another week before it gets bad enough to cause real trouble. Maybe less." Reuben was quiet. "The 2 men who looked at her," Della said, not unkindly. "Did they pull the shoe?" A pause. "No." "That's why they missed it." She walked past him out of the stall, and she did not look at his face, because she did not need to. She was given a room in the small addition off the back of the main house, not the bunkhouse, which she appreciated for practical reasons, and not the house proper, which she understood. A room with a window that faced east, and a hook on the back of the door, and a narrow bed with a wool blanket that smelled of cedar. She set her carpet bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the horse pasture going golden in the late afternoon light. And she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not safe exactly, not happy, but like she was in the right place. Like the land outside the window matched something inside her chest that had been looking for its correspondence. She allowed herself 10 minutes of that feeling. Then she went to find the kitchen, because she was hungry, and tomorrow was going to require her full attention. She was right about that. Reuben Cass. She had learned his name from the youngest ranch hand, a boy of about 19 named Tuck, who had the permanent expression of someone watching a situation develop that he didn't fully understand. Had been foreman of the Holt Ranch for 7 years. He was good at his job. He knew cattle and fencing and the particular diplomacy required to manage 6 men in close quarters. What he did not know, and what he had built his professional pride on not needing to know, was horses. Not the way Della knew them. The first day, she simply worked. She assessed the 12 horses in the near pasture methodically, one by one, the way her father had taught her, not looking for problems, but taking a true accounting of what was there. 2 of the geldings had uneven muscle development that suggested saddle fit issues. One of the mares was in the early stages of something in her hind that would become a real problem by winter if no one addressed it. She noted everything in the small leather book she kept in her apron pocket, the same book she had kept for 3 years on her father's farm, and she said nothing to anyone. Reuben watched her the way a cat watches a thing it hasn't decided about yet. The other hands watched Reuben to see what they were supposed to think. The second day, she was in the paddock with a young stallion that had been giving everyone trouble. He was 4 years old, green-broke, with more energy than he had learned to manage and a habit of testing the boundaries of whoever was handling him. He had put Tuck on the ground twice in the past week, which Tuck had reported with a mixture of injury and sheepishness. Della went into the paddock with a lead rope and nothing else. She didn't try to catch him. She walked to the center of the paddock and stood still with her back partly turned and waited. The stallion moved around the perimeter with his tail up and his eye on her, doing the thing young horses do, performing confidence to see if it would hold. She tracked him without looking directly at him, the way her father had stood in a paddock 1,000 times, the way she had stood beside him learning that the language of horses was mostly about where you put your attention and what you did with your body when they tested you. After 4 minutes, the stallion stopped moving. After 7, he took a step toward her. After 12, he was standing beside her with his nose at her shoulder and his whole body quieter than it had been since he was a foal. She heard the fence creak. She glanced over without breaking the stillness she was holding, and Reuben was there, both arms on the top rail, his face doing something it clearly did not do often. The laugh was gone, not replaced by anything warm, not yet, but the certainty that had been living in his expression since she walked up the lane yesterday was gone too, and that was its own kind of progress. She clipped the lead rope to the stallion's halter without rushing and walked him in a slow circle. She did not look at Reuben again. She didn't need to. That evening, Asa Holt came to the barn. She was finishing the evening feeding, working down the row of stalls, and she heard him come in. Those particular boots, a weight and a deliberateness to the step that she was already learning to recognize, the way you learn the particular sound of a door in a house you've just moved into. He came to the stall she was working in and leaned against the door frame, and she kept working because the horses didn't care who was watching, and neither, she had decided, did she. "Reuben says the stallion stood for you," he said. "He's not a bad horse," she said. "He's a young horse with too much going on in his head and not enough to do with it." "3 men have been trying to work him for a month." "They were working against him," she said. "You have to work with what a horse gives you, not against it, even when what it's giving you is difficult." She moved to the next stall. He followed without following, staying in the aisle, and she was aware of him the way she was aware of weather, not looking at it directly but knowing it was there. "The mare," he said. "Reuben pulled the shoe. You were right about the abscess." "I know," she said. A brief quiet. She thought she heard something in it that might have been amusement, but when she glanced at him, his expression was still level. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "Specifically." "My father." She moved hay from the barrow without pausing. "He had the best eye for horses of anyone I've ever met, and he thought I should have it too, so he taught me. Everything. Not the ladies' version of it. Everything. How to read a pedigree, how to evaluate a prospect, how to tell when an animal is in pain before the pain shows up anywhere visible." She paused. "He didn't have a son. He had me, and he decided that was the same thing." She had not meant to say that last part. It came out because she was tired, and because the barn had a way of making her say true things, the way barns always had. Asa was quiet for a moment. "He was right," he said. She looked at him then. He was looking at the horse in the stall she'd just left, and his face had the quality of a man who had said something he meant and was not going to take it back. She went back to work. But something had shifted, small and warm, in the architecture of the evening. The weeks settled into a shape. She worked with the horses in the mornings, the young stallion who was coming along faster than anyone had expected, and the rest of the string, each with their particular histories and peculiarities and needs. She kept her leather book and her notes, and by the end of the second week, she had a clear picture of the entire operation, its strengths and its gaps, written in the small, precise hand her father had made her practice until it was legible at speed. Reuben watched her. He had not warmed. He was not, she suspected, a man who warmed quickly or easily. But he had stopped laughing, and he had stopped making the small, dismissive sounds that had been his commentary on her first day. He gave her instructions in the mornings with a businesslike neutrality that was, from him, something close to respect. Tuck had decided she was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in his tenure at the ranch, and followed her around with the faithful persistence of a young dog, asking questions and then immediately answering them himself in the way of people who are nervous but enthusiastic. And Asa Holt came to the barn in the evenings. Not every evening, not with any stated purpose, but often enough that she stopped being surprised by the sound of his boots and started, against her better judgment, listening for them. He would come in during the last of the light and lean against a stall door or a post and talk to her about the horses, which ones he'd bought where, which bloodlines he was trying to establish, what he was hoping the young stallion would become. He talked about horses the way some men talked about their children, with a mixture of pride and anxiety, and the particular love that comes from having put real effort into something and wanting it to be worth that effort. She learned things about him sideways, the way you learn about a country by the things the people who live there mention without thinking. He had built the ranch himself, from a land grant and 6 horses and 3 years of work that he did not describe in any detail, but that she could read in the set of his hands and the way he moved through the property, as if every inch of it had cost him something, and he was quietly aware of the cost. His wife had died 4 years ago. She learned this not from him, but from Tuck, who mentioned it with the careful casualness of someone who has been told the subject is not discussed and is therefore discussing it carefully. Fever, in the 3rd year of the ranch. No children. Asa had not courted or kept company since, and Tuck said this with the tone of someone reporting a weather pattern that was simply a fact of the landscape. She filed this information in the place where she kept things that mattered and did not take it out again for a while. The first moment, the first real one, not the working kind, happened on a Thursday in the 4th week. She had been up since before dawn with one of the mares who was having a difficult time of it, a presentation issue that she had corrected by 3 in the morning, but that had left her strung out and tired in the particular way of a long night's vigil. The foal was healthy, the mare was recovering. Della was sitting on an overturned bucket in the aisle outside the stall when Asa came in, earlier than usual, and found her there. He stopped when he saw her. She was not in a state she would have chosen to be found in. Hair loose from its pins, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a smear of something on her forearm that she would rather not identify, and the deep-eyed look of a person who has been running on urgency for 6 hours and has just now run out of it. He didn't say anything about any of that. He went to the small stove at the end of the barn aisle. She hadn't known there was a stove there. Tuck must have put it in at some point. And she heard the sounds of iron and water and fire being coaxed together. And a few minutes later, he came back and held out a tin cup. Coffee. Hot. The best thing she had smelled in possibly her entire life. "The foal?" he said. "Healthy. A filly. She's going to be something." He nodded, looked into the stall at the mare and her new foal with that expression he had, the one that was not soft and was not hard and was simply the face of a man looking at something he cared about. Then he sat down on the barn floor beside her bucket. Not close, just there. The two of them in the early morning quiet of the barn, with the new foal making the small, uncertain sounds of first hours in the world. She drank her coffee. He didn't speak, and neither did she, and the silence had a quality she had forgotten was possible. The quality of two people who did not need to fill space with words because the space was already full. After a while, he said, "You should sleep." "Probably," she agreed. He stood, and she stood, and he reached out and very briefly, a half second, no more, put his hand at her elbow to steady her when she came up from the low bucket with less grace than she would have liked. The touch was nothing. It was a reflex. But she felt it all the way up her arm and into her chest, and she walked back to her room in the early light, thinking about a man who sat on a barn floor without being asked and handed a woman coffee without making anything of it. She was in serious trouble. She was aware of this. She filed this information alongside the other things she knew about him and tried to be sensible. She was not entirely sensible. The second moment happened at the fence line on a Sunday evening 2 weeks after the foaling. She had taken to walking the pasture fence in the late afternoon, partly to check for damage and partly because the light at that hour was the kind of light that made her feel less like someone in difficulty and more like someone in a landscape. She was at the far south corner, watching the young stallion. She had started calling him Drum in her head because of the way his hooves sounded on the dry ground, when she heard the gate and turned to see Asa coming along the fence line toward her. He had not come out to find her. She could tell that. He had come to look at the fence, specifically the post at the corner that had been listing since spring, and he had a post driver with him. She stayed where she was and watched him work, because there was nothing impolite about that, and because she wanted to. He worked the way he did everything, without waste, without performance. He didn't grunt or make theater of the effort. He just drove the post back to plumb with the methodical application of force, and then checked it with his hand and moved on to the next one that needed attention. She said, without particularly planning to, "My father used to say you could tell everything about a man from the way he handled a fence post." He paused, looked at her over his shoulder. "What did he say it told you?" "Whether he cared about the small things," she said. "Whether he thought the work was beneath him. Whether he understood that the whole thing falls down if you let one post go." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the post he'd just set. "Smart man," he said. He had his moments. He came and stood beside her at the rail, and they both looked at Drum, who was doing his evening circuit of the pasture with the particular self-possession of an animal that had found its confidence and was enjoying it. "He's changed," Asa said, "in a month." "He just needed someone to listen to him," she said. She felt Asa look at her then, a look she did not turn to meet, and the moment extended and then contracted, and neither of them moved. And then Drum came trotting over to the fence rail and inserted himself between them by putting his nose into Della's hair, which broke the moment entirely and made her laugh, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere she hadn't been in a long time. Asa smiled. She had not seen him smile before, not a real one, and it did something unexpected to his face. It made him look like someone younger and less resolved, like a door opening onto a room that had been closed for a very long time. She looked away before he could see what she was doing with her own face. The trouble came from Reuben, which was not what she had expected, and from a direction she had not been watching. She had been at the ranch 6 weeks when she found the ledger. Not snooping, she had been asked to take inventory of the tack room, which had become a chaos of unlabeled equipment and borrowed items that had never been returned, and the ledger had been on the shelf with the invoices and receipts that were supposed to track purchases. She had opened it to understand the inventory system and found instead a record of purchases that did not match what was in the barn. It took her an hour to work through it carefully because she wanted to be certain before she was anything else. When she was certain, she sat with the ledger in her lap for a while and thought about what she was looking at. Reuben Cass had been padding the purchase records for the better part of 2 years. Not dramatically, not the kind of theft that announced itself. The careful, patient kind. $1 here on feed, $2 there on equipment, a horse purchased for one price and recorded at another. Added together, over the months she calculated, it came to something significant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days. She did not sit with it comfortably. She sat with it the way you sit with something sharp, carefully, and not for longer than necessary. She thought about what it meant to bring this to Asa and what it meant not to. She thought about Reuben, who was not a good man in the way that warm people are good, but who was competent and loyal to the ranch in every way except this one. She thought about what it would do to him and what it would do to her, and in the end she thought about her father, who had said that the most expensive thing you can ever own is a truth you're afraid to speak. She went to Asa on a Tuesday morning, before the workday had fully started, and she brought the ledger. She set it on the kitchen table and opened it to the pages she had marked and said, "I need to show you something. I found this while I was doing the tack room inventory. I want you to know I was not looking for it." He looked at the ledger, then at her, then back at the ledger. He sat down and read through what she had marked, slowly, with the kind of attention that does not hurry because it cannot afford to miss anything. His face was very still. She stood across the table and watched the stillness and tried to read what was behind it and could not, and then she stopped trying and just waited. When he looked up, his expression was not what she expected. She had braced for something, anger, or the particular look of a man finding out he has been made a fool of. What she saw instead was something more complicated, a kind of grief almost. The look of a man who had trusted something and was now holding the evidence that the trust had been misplaced. "How long?" he said. "By my calculation, 22 months, she said. "I could be wrong. I only have what's in this ledger." He closed the book. "You're not wrong." He was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that was not comfortable to receive, because it carried inside it the acknowledgement of what it had cost her to bring this to him instead of leaving it alone. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know that," he said. He stood, and she thought the conversation was over, and then he said, "What would you have done if you'd decided not to bring it to me?" She thought about it honestly. "Left," she said, "because I couldn't have stayed knowing it and said nothing." He looked at her with that unguarded expression, the one that lived behind the set jaw and the steady eyes, and she held it without looking away because she was not afraid of being seen. Then he picked up the ledger and went to find Reuben. She did not witness that conversation. She went to the barn and worked because the horses needed feeding regardless of what was happening in the yard, and because she needed the horses the way she always needed them when the human world was doing something complicated. Reuben left that afternoon. She watched him ride out from the barn doorway, and she did not feel triumph, which she had half expected to feel, and did not feel guilt, which she had been half afraid of. She felt only the particular quiet of a thing resolved, and underneath it, something she did not name yet but recognized. Tuck appeared at her elbow. "Mr. Holt wants to see you," he said, with the expression of someone who has been carrying this message and is relieved to be rid of it. She found Asa on the porch. The evening was coming in, the sky going that particular amber that seemed to belong specifically to this part of the territory, and he was standing at the railing looking west. He did not turn when she came out. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "When you arrived, I gave you a test instead of a conversation. That wasn't—" He stopped, started differently. "Reuben's opinion of you was there in his face before he said a word. I let him run that errand when I should have handled it myself. That wasn't right." She leaned against the other railing and looked at the same sky he was looking at. "You gave me a fair chance," she said. "That's more than most would have." "It's not enough." "No," she agreed, "but it's a start." He turned then and looked at her directly, and the last of the light was behind him, and she could see his face clearly, the lines of it, the history in it, the thing that lived in his eyes that she had been carefully not naming for 6 weeks. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position," he said. "Not—" He caught himself, recalibrated. "A permanent position with the horses. The management of the breeding program, with wages that reflect the work, not the way you arrived here." She looked at him. He was very still, in the way of a man who was offering more than the words said and was aware of it. "I'll think about it," she said. The surprise in his face was brief and then gone, replaced by something that might, on a more readable man, have been called hope. "All right," he said. She went inside because she needed to not be in front of him for a few minutes. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the shelf above the stove, a new shelf installed recently because her herbs had been on the floor and he had noticed and fixed it without saying anything. And she let herself feel the full weight of where she was and what was happening and what it might mean. She was done being sensible. She had been sensible for a long time, and it had not saved her from anything. She went back out to the porch. He was still there. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "To the position," she said. "I'll take it." Something moved through his face that she was finally willing to look at directly. It was not just satisfaction at the business matter resolved. It was the expression of a man who has been alone in a place for a long time and has just heard a door open. "Good," he said. And then, after a pause that contained considerable more than the word itself, "I'm glad you're staying." The crisis arrived from Kentucky. A letter on a Wednesday in an envelope with a Cincinnati postmark. She recognized the handwriting before she opened it and felt the cold move through her the way cold moves through a structure before a freeze. Into the gaps first, then the bones. Her husband's brother. Marcus Crane. Not a Crane by blood, her husband's brother by his father's second marriage, had been a presence at the edges of her life for 4 years, and at the center of it for the 11 months since the funeral. He was a man who expressed his worst instincts through the legal system, which made them harder to fight, and he had decided, somewhere in those 11 months, that there was money he was owed by the arrangement, and he intended to collect it. The letter was careful. It was the careful kind of legal threat that someone writes when they want the recipient to know what is coming without yet being in a position to send the real thing. He had, he wrote, discovered irregularities in the handling of her late husband's estate. He intended to challenge the disposition of certain assets, and he had, he noted, made inquiries as to her current whereabouts. That last line. She read the letter 3 times and then set it down on her small table and looked out the window at the horse pasture and thought carefully. She had done nothing wrong. She was clear on that. The estate had been modest, and she had taken nothing that wasn't hers to take, which was to say almost nothing, because almost nothing was what her husband had left. But Marcus had money, and a lawyer, and the particular advantage of a man who is wrong but persistent. And she was a woman alone in a territory, and those two things did not balance easily on a scale. She thought about telling Asa. She thought about not telling him, which was the more familiar option, the option she had been practicing her whole adult life, the not burdening people, the carrying it alone. She thought about what it would mean to bring this to him and have him look at her differently. She did not tell him. She spent a week telling herself she was going to and not doing it. And in that week, she was quieter than she had been, and she saw Asa notice the quiet and choose not to press it. And the restraint of that noticing and not pressing was somehow worse than if he had asked directly. The second letter arrived 10 days after the first. It was no longer careful. Marcus had located her. He intended to arrive in Cutter's Bluff within the fortnight. He intended to make clear, to whatever community she had installed herself in, the true circumstances of her departure from Cincinnati and her character as he understood it. He was, he assured her, acting only out of concern for the proper resolution of his brother's estate. She read it at the kitchen table, early morning, before the house was fully awake. She made a decision. She would leave before he arrived. She would not bring this to Asa's door. She had been here 8 weeks, and she had put down roots she hadn't planned to put down. And the sensible thing, the necessary thing, was to pull them up cleanly before someone else did it for her and made more of a mess. She started packing her carpet bag. She was halfway through it when she heard boots on the porch. Not Tuck's boots. She knew Tuck's by now. These boots. She stopped moving. The door was open. He came to the door frame and stopped there when he saw the bag on the bed. His face did not move. "What is that?" he said. She was very tired. She was tired in the way that made honesty feel like the only possible option because deception required energy she no longer had. "I've had some letters from Cincinnati," she said. "My husband's brother. He intends to come here and cause difficulty, and I would rather not have that difficulty follow me into your house and your business." He came inside. He sat down in the chair by the window, which was the chair she sat in when she read, and he looked at her with the look he had when he was reading the important things, level and patient and entirely present. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She told him about Marcus and the estate and the letters and the things she had been carrying for 10 days in the particular alone way she had always carried things. She told it without embellishment and without self-pity, the way her father had taught her to give an accounting of something, clearly, in sequence, without theater. When she finished, Asa was quiet. "You were going to leave," he said, "without telling me." "I was going to leave so you wouldn't have to deal with—" "Without telling me," he said again. Not louder, just more precisely, and she understood that the issue, for him, was not the situation, but the leaving without telling part of it, and she felt something shift in her chest. "Yes," she said. He stood. He went to the window and looked out at the yard for a moment, and she watched the set of his shoulders and tried to read them and couldn't quite. "My wife died," he said, still looking at the window. 4 years ago. I was in the south pasture when it happened. She was sick for 3 days, and she told me it was nothing, and she did not want to worry me." He paused. "She was protecting me. I understand why she did it. I have not been able to forgive her for it, which is not rational, but is true." Della sat very still. "I'm not asking you to stay because of the horses," he said. He turned from the window. "I'm asking you to stay because you are the first person I have met in 4 years who walks into my barn in the morning and makes it feel like something other than a place I manage." He looked at her directly, with no hedge in it. "And I would like you to stop deciding what I can and cannot manage on my behalf. I would prefer to decide that myself." She looked at him for a long moment. "Marcus is a determined man," she said. "So am I," he said. She thought about the fence post, the coffee before dawn, the shelf above the stove. She thought about a man who sat on a barn floor without being asked and had not made anything of it and had been making everything of it, quietly, in all the ways that mattered. "All right," she said. She took the things back out of the carpet bag. Marcus Crane arrived on a Friday, as promised, riding in on a hired horse from the stage stop with his coat pressed and his purpose visible from 50 yards. He came to the ranch, not the town, which told her he was not interested in winning the community over. He was interested in winning her over, or, failing that, in frightening her. She met him in the yard. Asa stood on the porch. He did not come down. She had asked him not to, not yet. And she went forward alone the way she had always gone forward alone, which was without hesitation and without showing the cost of it. Marcus dismounted. He was a trim man, well-dressed, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy until you had known him long enough to see the patience behind it. The patience of a man who waited for weakness the way water waits for the low ground. "Della," he said, warm as poison. "Marcus," she said. He looked past her at Asa on the porch. He looked back at her. She watched him recalculating, updating his picture with the new information, and she watched the calculation complete and the warmth in his voice adjust accordingly. "I've come a long way," he said. "I think we can resolve this quietly. There are certain documents that relate to my brother's estate." "There are no documents," she said. "There was no estate worth disputing. What there was a rented room and a debt at the dry goods, both of which I settled from my own pocket. You know this." "The farm," he said. "Your father's farm was sold before my husband and I married to pay my father's debts, and not a penny of it came to me. You know that also." He looked at her with the long-suffering expression of a man who is pretending to be misunderstood. "I have letters," he said. "Correspondence that suggests your departure from Cincinnati was less voluntary than you've represented. That you left owing—" "I have receipts," she said. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the folded papers she had carried since Cincinnati. The same ones she had carried since before that, since she had understood, in the weeks after the funeral, that Marcus was the kind of man who would eventually come, and that when he came, she intended to be ready. She held them out. "Every debt, paid, dated and witnessed. The room, the dry goods, the funeral costs that he left unpaid and that I settled because I am not the kind of woman who leaves her husband's debts behind her." She kept her hand steady. "You are welcome to take them to whatever lawyer you have retained and ask him to explain to you why they are complete." Marcus looked at the papers. She watched the calculation behind his eyes finish running and come up empty. She heard boots on the porch steps. Asa came down into the yard and stood beside her, and he did not say anything. He simply stood there, his presence the particular kind of statement that required no words. "Mr. Crane," he said after a moment to Marcus, "I think you've had a long ride for something you already knew the answer to. There's water at the trough for your horse. I'd suggest you be on the road before dark." Marcus looked between them. He was not a stupid man. He understood when a situation had closed against him. He left without taking the water. They stood in the yard and watched the dust settle behind him, and then Asa looked at her, at the papers still in her hand, and said, "You've been carrying those since Cincinnati." "Since 3 days after the funeral," she said. He shook his head very slightly, the way you shake your head at something that moves you and you don't want to make too much of. Then he put his hand at the small of her back, just briefly, to guide her toward the porch, and neither of them breathed for a moment, and then they both did. The evening came in slow and golden over the Holt ranch, the way it did at this time of year, laying long shadows across the yard and the pasture and the fence line she had walked 100 times now and knew by memory. Drum was in the near pasture. He came to the rail when he saw her and stood there with his chin on the top board, which was something he had started doing recently, this casual claiming of proximity, and she put her hand on his neck and felt him settle. Asa came and stood beside her. They were quiet together in the easy way they had arrived at somewhere in the last 2 months, the way of two people who have found the particular frequency of each other's silence and no longer need to fill it. After a while, he said, "I need to ask you something." She kept her eyes on the horses. "I've been trying to think of the right way to say it for about 3 weeks," he said. "I've concluded there isn't a right way and I should just say it." She turned and looked at him. I would like you to stay, he said. Not in the way I asked before, in the other way. She looked at his face, the lines of it, the history in it, the thing in his eyes that she had been carefully and then not so carefully naming for the past many weeks. You drove a fence post back to Plum on a Sunday evening, she said, when you didn't have to, when no one was watching. Someone was watching, he said. Yes, she said. I was. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just took it, folded it into his, and held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. Is that a yes? He said. That's a yes, she said. Drum blew softly through his nose and went back to grazing, as if the matter was settled and he had other concerns. They married in October, on the porch, with the cottonwoods along the creek gone yellow and the air cold enough to see your breath. Tuck cried, which he denied. The hands from the neighboring ranch came, because word had gotten around the way things got around in this part of the territory, not through announcement, but through the accumulated weight of small, true things that people noticed and talked about. Reuben Cass was not there. He had moved on to a spread 3 counties east, and she heard, some months later, that he had squared his account with the man he'd left it with, which she thought was probably its own kind of resolution. She kept her leather book. She filled 3 more of them over the years, with notes on the horses and the breeding program that became, in time, known across the territory as something worth the knowing. Her father's name was in those pages often. His teachings, his methods, the things he had given her instead of a different kind of life, which had turned out to be exactly the right kind of life for the life she was going to have. Asa built her a desk in the tack room, without being asked, from good wood, with a shelf above it for the books. She put a photograph of her father on that shelf, and a piece of limestone she had carried from Kentucky in the bottom of her carpet bag, and a small glass jar with a dried sprig of bluegrass in it, because some things you carry forward as a way of honoring where you came from. On winter evenings, she could hear Drum moving in his stall from where she sat at that desk, the particular sound of a horse that was well-fed and unhurried and at peace. She could hear Asa somewhere in the house, the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the occasional door, the ordinary domestic music of a life shared with another person who knew where everything was and had put it there together. She had come west running from something. She had arrived somewhere she was not expected and had not been wanted, and she had proven herself through the particular calculus of work and competence and the quiet courage of a woman who did not flinch. And she had found, in the finding, that the thing she had been running from was not behind her at all. It was simply the old life making room for this one. She had learned that from the horses, really. You don't fight what a horse gives you. You work with it, and you wait. And if you are patient enough, and honest enough, and willing enough to stay in the space even when it is uncertain, eventually, the thing that has been circling comes and stands beside you and breathes. If you've ever had to prove yourself to a room that had already made up its mind about you, and come out the other side, leave a word in the comments. And if this story gave you something to hold on to today, a like and a subscription keep these voices coming. What would you have done in her boots when the foreman laughed? Come back tomorrow. There's always another story waiting, and the fire's still warm.